Okay.
I will let everyone in.
Okay. Also, I need to share a screen.
I'm on it. Everyone's moving around. There we go. Okay, you are co-host.
Great. Okay. Thank you.
Mhm.
Good morning, everybody. We'll wait just about another minute for people to come on. Hope
Good
everybody.
morning, Rabbi.
Good morning. You all have a good week?
Yes, I'm not gonna stay for the class of Hebrew because I have an appointment for second dose of the shot, the
Oh,
COVID
that's
shot,
important.
and I'm leaving right after your class.
Okay.
Yes.
All right. Well, that's great. It's a good thing to definitely have that, get that done. Yeah.
Yeah.
Very liberating.
Right. Right.
Um, so today we're going to talk about Israel. Last week we talked, I guess, about anti-Semitism. As I said, that's a topic that's kind of a required for the class. Today we're going to talk about Israel and and we'll touch on the question of when is criticism of Israel sort of cross the line into anti-Semitism. So, but let's start by talking about Israel. So I think most people are going to be here who are going to be here, and people join a little late, they can catch up. Good morning. So I'm going to share a screen, and the handout should be in the website now. They should be loaded. You can download it if you'd like, but this is the handout, and let's take a look at it. So Israel is important to Jews in a variety of ways, and it's really the first four items on this outline here are the sort of the different ways that I've kind of divided up the importance of Israel for the Jewish people. So the first, and I think very important issue is the historical connection, of course, that Jews have with Israel. We, of course, see ourselves sort of historically dating back to the time of Abraham, who we consider the first Jew. And what did God tell Abraham to do? The first thing he told Abraham to do something: leave your father's home, which was at that time in Syria, in a city called Haran in Syria. Leave your father's home and go to a place that I will show you. And the place that God shows him, of course, ends up being what we later call Israel. At the time, it was called Canaan, and the Canaanites were living there. But so that's where he first goes. And so if in the Bible, you start with Genesis, Abraham, and then his son Isaac, and then his grandson Jacob all live in Israel. Jacob has 12 sons and a daughter who he raises in Israel. And then, of course, Joseph ends up being sold into slavery in Egypt. When there's a famine, the rest of the family joins him in Egypt. And that's where the book of Genesis ends. So the book of Exodus begins with the Israelites being enslaved by the Egyptians there for a couple hundred years. But within the first 3 or 4 chapters of Exodus, there arises Moses, who is brought up in the Pharaoh's home. He flees Egypt after killing an Egyptian taskmaster, goes to the wilderness for what the tradition says is 40 more years, and then is called at the burning bush to go rescue his people. And all of that happens within the opening few chapters of Exodus. By Exodus chapter 12, the 10th plague has already happened, and the Israelites are leaving Egypt. So at the very opening chapters of Exodus, even though hundreds of years have elapsed, the rest of the story is now going to be about the journey back to the homeland. And for the rest of the 5 books of Moses, they're wandering through the wilderness, but that's not their destination. Their destination is Israel. And so the very next book, Joshua, is the conquest of the land. Judges is more of the conquest of the land. The book of Samuel then has the first Kings, And then, of course, the Book of Kings is the rest of the history of First Temple Judaism. So briefly, the Israelites are exiled for about 50 years in Babylonia, and then the Persians under Cyrus tell the Israelites to return, and they spend the next several hundred years in Israel. So the entire Bible is about the Jews living in their homeland or trying to get to their homeland, almost the entire Bible. And after the Bible's over, they're back in their homeland and they're living there again for several centuries until after a few revolts against Rome, the Romans kicked them out of Jerusalem. They continue to live in scattered places around Israel, but they also scatter throughout the Roman and Babylonian empires, but always with the idea that we're going to return. So the biblical connection, our formative centuries, were in Israel. Immediately after the temple is destroyed, the rabbis, as we've discussed, replaced the temple ritual, which was sacrifices, with a set of prayers. And the prayer structures reflect the strong desire, the strong aspiration that the Jews should return to their homeland and rebuild their country and rebuild the temple. It's all over the prayers, even in places where the rabbis didn't intend the prayers to say that. Later prayer writers included that idea into those prayers as well. So this very strong desire, like salmon swimming upstream to get home, is this Jewish desire to return to the homeland and rebuild the temple. And even outside of liturgy, throughout the rest of the several centuries, there were from time to time messianic movements, people who thought they were the Messiah, inspired by God, to cause the return of the Jews to their homeland. One of the most, well, first of all, after the Spanish expulsion, in Spain, 1492, there was one Jewish belief that the Messiah would come after a disaster happened, and the crushing of the flourishing Jewish community in Spain, which had existed there for centuries and was really a flowering culture there. So the expulsion of the Jews from Spain was considered exactly that kind of disaster. And everywhere in the Jewish world, the thought was that that meant the Messiah was just around the corner. And particularly when the Turkish Empire begins, the Ottoman Empire arises, invites Jews from the fleeing Spanish countries to come into Turkey, and then conquers Israel as part of its expansion. Even more so, people begin to think that this is the Messiah's coming. We're welcomed into the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire now controls Israel. Many Jews moved to a northern city called Sfat at that time and anticipated the Messiah was just around the corner. So that was certainly one of the most famous incidences. A little bit later was another guy named Shabtai Tzvi, who you can Google if you'd like, and learn about his, I don't know, ignoble career. I don't know. He claimed to be the Messiah. Many people followed him. It did not end well. But there were many other people throughout the centuries, and always with this idea of returning home. So the reason I mention this and the importance of it, first of all, it is our homeland. Secondly, it was where Jews always thought we would eventually return. And thirdly, when political Zionism begins really in the 1800s, it didn't grow out of thin air, right? It was planted in the soil of this long time historical connection of the Jews to the land. So now let's talk about the political Zionism, which really kind of begins around the 1800s. It begins then because that's when nationalism is becoming a very popular movement all over the world. So the United States forms its country in 1776. The French Revolution sort of launches a French nationalist movement. And then other countries follow in Europe, and so there's sort of nationalism is in the air. And so the Jews are definitely starting to try and figure out how they can create their country in their homeland as well. But they weren't organized really, like galvanized, I would say, until Theodor Herzl, who you probably should Google to learn about. I think there's an article about him in Jewish Literacy, the book for our class by Joseph Telushkin. But you can also Google or look up the Wikipedia article. Theodor Herzl was a journalist working for a Viennese newspaper. He was from Vienna, but he was stationed in France. And after the Franco-Russian War, France deeply believed that they had been betrayed by some traitor who had caused them to suffer losses against the Russians. I believe it was the French Franco-Russian War. And as a result of that, they tried to find who the spy was. Some evidence was planted on a Jewish officer named Dreyfus, and they tried him for treason. And Theodor Herzl, being the journalist from Vienna and also a Jew, covered the trial. And during the course of the trial, it became obvious that Dreyfus had been framed, but it didn't matter. The jury, the French jury, convicted him anyway of treason. And that's when Herzl decided that the Jews had to leave Europe. Why? Because Napoleon, earlier during the First Revolution, promised the Jews that he would emancipate them, take them out of the ghettos, and give them full French citizenship, provided that they would swear allegiance to this new nation state of France. And he, had commissioned this group of rabbis, who we called the Sanhedrin, to answer questions to kind of indicate whether they would be loyal citizens of France or whether they, there's always this suspicion among Europeans that the Jews were not going to really be loyal to the countries they lived in. So the rabbis answered the questions to Napoleon's satisfaction, and as he promised, he liberated the Jews and gave them citizenship. And of course, the banner motto of the French Revolution was fraternity, equality, liberty, right? So brotherhood and equality was part of the French Revolution's motto. And so if you expected anywhere in Europe to free itself from anti-Semitism, which had been percolating for centuries, it should have been France. And yet, here's Theodor Herzl covering this trial, and this French Jew officer was convicted of treason when it was obvious that he had been framed. And Herzl concluded that the only reason that could have happened was continuing anti-Semitism in the supposedly enlightened country of France. And if the supposedly enlightened France would harbor such vicious anti-Semitism even in the late 1800s, certainly Vienna, where he came from, and other countries in Europe were worse. And the Jews were not going to live long in Europe. They had to get out. He was very prescient in that, very prophetic. By the way, he was a secular Jew, but very prophetic in his prediction about the fate of Jews in Europe. And that's what inspired him finally to galvanize the Jewish world to formulate a plan to return to Israel. And so he, without television, without even telephones, and they did have telegraphs, but that was about it. He managed to communicate with Jews around the world and organized the first International Zionist Congress in Basel in 1897. He wrote in his diary, I mean, this is just an unbelievable thing. He kept a diary. In his diary, after the first night of the Congress, when they voted on, they were trying to figure out how to get the world powers to recognize Jewish right to return to their homeland. He writes in his diary in 1897, "I know people will think I'm crazy, But I really believe that in 50 years, we will have our country. He wrote it in 1897. 50 years later was 1947. And that's when the UN voted the partition plan. Herzl, of course, died only a few years after the conference. He was from illness. So he never lived to see his prophecy come true. But he, again, a secular Jew, amazingly prescient about the fate of the Jews in Europe, amazingly prescient about how long it would take to get a Jewish state. And he was really right on the money. So he organized this World Zionist Conference, and they were figuring out. So who was in charge in 1897? Who was in control of what was then called Palestine? The Ottoman Empire still. So they made entreaties to the Ottoman Empire. They made entreaties to other countries in Europe to sort of convince them to convince the Ottoman Empire. But they started to put in place funding. They started raising money to buy land in Israel, and to organize settlements of Jews, pioneers who would go and settle the land, which at the time in the north was some of the area in the north was swampland and infested with mosquitoes and malaria. It was not well populated. It's not that there were no people living there. There were some people living there, but it was not a highly populated area. Jerusalem was not much. It was really the only Jerusalem existed within the walled city, which was the city that was walled in by the Ottoman Empire. The walls were rebuilt by the Ottoman Empire in the 1500s and was less than a square mile. And that was the entire city of Jerusalem. But then Jews started buying land outside the old city and creating neighborhoods outside the old city and buying apartments inside the old city, and other places throughout Israel to start to settle it. That was all kind of galvanized by Herzl, although that project had been in process earlier. Herzl really put the pieces together in a much more concerted effort. So that was political Zionism. The idea was, Herzl's idea was, the Jews are really going to always be seen as outsiders in every country they live in. The only way that they could get an equal footing with other people of the world is to have their own country where they will no longer be outsiders and their destiny will be in their own hands. So that's the idea of political Zionism. So there was also, this longstanding religious Zionism before Zionism became a political thing, right? And that, as I said, was based on the biblical history, based on our prayers. So it's all written all over our liturgy. By the way, going back to the Psalms, one of the Psalms talks about returning from the Babylonian exile and how we were dreamers. We couldn't imagine we'd return home, and now here we are home again. Psalm 100 and I'm going to get my Psalm number wrong. I should know it, but it's like 127 or something. We sing it before the grace after the meals on Shabbat and festivals, about the return to our home. So there was always a religious idea about a return. And actually, even when we were not in control of the land, and even without political Zionism, it's written into the legal literature, the halakha, that it's a mitzvah, a commandment to live in Israel if you're able to do so. And Maimonides, for instance, when he left Spain, his family left Spain, they crossed over North Africa, and they briefly went to Israel. But at the time, Israel was held by the Christian Crusaders and was not hospitable to Jews. And so the family had to leave Israel and ended up settling in Egypt. That's just an example. Jews throughout the centuries saw it as a mitzvah to live in Israel if it was possible, and some of them tried, and some of them were successful in living there. So there was a religious connection to the land, the historical connection to the land, the political connection to the land, and finally, a cultural connection to the land. There was something called cultural Zionism, and sort of the one of the leaders of that movement took the pen name Achad Ha'am, which means one the people. And that's a link, hyperlink, so you can click on that and go to the article in the Wikipedia about him. He, again, was not a religious Jew. He was a cultural Jew. What does that mean? We don't know what his beliefs were about God, but he studied Jewish literature, which included the Bible and rabbinic commentaries on the Bible and Talmud and Midrash. So he was well versed in Jewish literature because he was a cultural Jew. He may not have prayed 3 times a day. I don't know if he kept kosher, but he was very steeped in Jewish culture. And his idea was the Jews are a people like other people in the world. French have French culture, the Italians have Italian culture, the Greeks have Greek culture, and we have our culture. But we're not able to really celebrate our culture when we're scattered around the world, subjugated to the peoples of various countries. The only way our culture is going to flower is if we get our own place and we're living all together in a condensed way. And then the Jewish culture will naturally arise from that, from the sort of the gathering of our people from all over and sort of the interaction of everybody with everybody else. That will cause a flowering of Jewish culture. And who knows what that'll lead to, he believed, but it will be amazing. And again, he was quite right about that. He was 100% right about that. And that is one of the things I'll talk about shortly in a separate outline, about the cultural aspect of having our homeland again. By the way, so I said he was not necessarily religious, but I think I quoted a paragraph from his writing when we talked about the Sabbath. This just give you an idea of what he said. He said, more than the Jews have kept the Sabbath, and that's the translation from the Hebrew, Lishmoret Shabbat, is to observe or to preserve or keep the Sabbath, right? That's the commandment in the 10 Commandments, to Shamoret Yom HaShabbat, to observe to keep the Sabbath. But he said, more than the Jews have kept the Sabbath has kept the Jews. And his point was, it's a weekly reminder that we are a people that is somewhat separate from whatever culture we're living in. We have our own calendar, we have our own holidays, we have our own identity. And although we respect and support the countries we live in, because it's important, that promotes peace and peaceful relations, we are distinct. But we can be most distinct, and that culture can flower the best if we had our own country again. So that was cultural Zionism. So actually, during World War I, remember the Ottoman Empire and Germany were on one side of the war, and France and Britain and the United States were on the other side of the war in World War I. And during the war, a gentleman named Chaim Weizmann was a chemist, and he discovered a way to make acetone with materials that were readily available in England. Before he came up with this chemical formula, England had to import acetone. And acetone, I'm not a chemist, and I'm not a weapons manufacturer, but my understanding is that acetone is necessary in the making of explosives. At least was necessary in the explosives that were being used at that time. And so Britain could not manufacture explosives for the war without importing acetone. Weizmann discovered a way to do it with materials that were readily available in England. He patented the formula, became somewhat wealthy, and in addition, because he was able to do this for good old England, he became friendly with some of the British aristocracy, including Lord Balfour, who was the foreign minister for England. And he convinced, Chaim Weizmann was a Zionist, and he convinced Lord Balfour to get the government to issue a decree that the British government would support the right of the Jewish people to a homeland in Palestine, and they did, and that's called the Balfour Declaration, named after the foreign minister, Lord Balfour. So that was partly brought about by the urging of Chaim Weizmann, who was a well-respected person in the British Empire. So as at the end of the war, as the war is ending, World War I, the French and the British, in their good old colonial fashion, colonialism was still a thing. And before the war was over, they together took out a map of the Middle East and carved it up between themselves and decided who was going to rule over which parts of the Middle East. And as a result of carving out the different elements, that's how we got the modern countries of Iraq and Syria and Lebanon. As you probably know from our unfortunate experience in Iraq, it's not a homogeneous country. It actually was three different cultural ethnic groups that were kind of mushed together thanks to the British and the French. So a lot of the problems in the Middle East now are a result of their colonial efforts, or at least that's one way to look at it. But part of that process was giving an outline to the what would become the Palestine Mandate, the area of Palestine that was going to be in the hands of the British. And so by the end of World War I, with the Balfour Declaration saying that British looks with favor upon the creation of a Jewish homeland in Palestine, and now they are in control of Palestine as a result of this Sykes-Picot agreement. Sykes was the British officer, Picot was the French officer who drew the map. The British now seem to be poised to actually put into effect the idea that the Jews will return to their homeland. And things originally seemed to be going okay in many ways with the Arabs who were living there. The Arabs were also looking to develop their own nationalist identities. And they saw the Jewish people coming in as at least initially, some of them saw it as a positive thing for their own building up of their own national identities. But at some point, perhaps because there were too many Jews coming in or something, things went south, and the Arabs decided they did not want to have the Jews there. There were unfortunate, bloody battles in the late 1920s, and so the British government decides that they like the oil from the Arab countries, and they make it difficult for the Jews to actually move to Israel. So they kind of renege on the Balfour Declaration. And unfortunately, they don't allow very many Jews to immigrate to Israel in the intervening years between World War I and World War II. And even with the rise of Hitler, they continued to prevent Jews from immigrating to Palestine. So that kind of, and of course, every other country in Europe and even the United States prevented any large number of Jews from escaping Europe. So the Jews were kind of locked into the prison of Europe at the time when Hitler was preparing to destroy them. At the end of the Holocaust, what we call the Holocaust, the end of World War II, when there were videos of the survivors of the death camps who looked like walking skeletons, and it was broadcast around the world, and it became inescapably well known around the world what had happened to the Jewish people in Europe. The matter of the Jewish fate was kicked back to the United Nations, which was newly formed after, I forgot to mention that the League of Nations was formed after World War I. And the League of Nations affirmed the Balfour Declaration that the Jewish people should have a right to a homeland in Palestine. So it kind of was already enshrined in international law, but this never acted on. Now, after World War II, the matter was kicked back to the United Nations. The United Nations held hearings. They listened to testimony from Arabs, testimony from Jews. And the conclusion of the United Nations was that you had two people who were fighting over the same land, and they had different aspirations, and the two people's aspirations could not be successfully blended into one successful country. And therefore, what had to happen was a partition of Palestine into two parts, a Jewish state and an Arab state. And that's when the United Nations voted to partition Palestine. I also left out one other important thing. I don't have the maps, but one of the things I gave you, I'll show you, is a link to the history from the American Jewish Committee, and I believe that includes the maps. The original Palestine mandate that was given to England by the Sykes-Picot Agreement included all of Jordan, what is now called the country of Jordan. At the time, it was called Transjordan, because everything is Eurocentric, and trans means the other side, and Jordan means the Jordan River. So Transjordan meant that part of the Palestine Mandate, which was on the other side of the Jordan River from the side that England is on. Right? England's to the west, so Transjordan is east. So east of the Jordan River became a separate country just called Jordan. And England did that on it, Britain did that on its own after inheriting the Palestine Mandate, because they wanted to give the Hashemite kingdom, the Hashemite clan, a kingdom. So they did, and they gave it to, and that's how Jordan began. So you will hear some very right-wing Zionist people say, well, you know, the original, you know, Palestine Mandate included the whole state of Jordan. We already lost 3/4 of that before we even got started in 1948. That's kind of an absurd kind of maximalist claim, in my opinion. Historical Israel had not too much to do with a little bit east of the Jordan River, at least in biblical times, right? 1.5 tribes lived east of the Jordan River, according to the Bible, but the borders of Israel varied greatly during biblical times. So there's not making a historical claim based on biblical boundaries is a complex matter. It's not an easy matter at all, because the borders changed all the time, even in biblical times. In any case, Jordan was now separated. So what was left of Palestine was from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea. The United Nations votes to partition that territory up into two parts, an Arab state and a Jewish state. The most of the fertile land was given to the Arabs, but some coastline was given to the Jews. The bulk of the Jewish state was the desert in the Negev in the south that was parched and would take a lot of work to make it habitable and to make it available for farmland. In any case, that was the deal. The Jews accepted the partition plan of the Palestinians or the Arabs. They weren't called Palestinians yet. Everybody was called Palestinians back then. Jews were called Palestinians back then. But the Arabs rejected the plan. The Jews accepted the plan. Britain prepared to pull out as per the agreement. The Jews declared independence. There was a lot of assistance given by some British officers to the Arab side, because everybody knew there was going to be a big war. There was a blockade preventing the Jews from getting weapons. And almost everybody assumed that it was going to be a slaughter. That as soon as the British pulled out, the Jews would be just overrun. The Egyptians, the Jordanians, the Syrians all had armies. And the other Arabs many Arabs had been trained by some of the British officers. And it was going to be a mess. Nevertheless, the Jews had managed to smuggle weapons in past the blockade. And they had training from one or two British officers. Ord Wingate was one of them. He's considered a hero in Israel. And also an American Jewish officer who is sort of lionized in a Hollywood movie called Cast a Giant Shadow. And his name is Mickey Marcus. And he was actually a lawyer in the American Army. And so he drafted up the Israeli Army's first laws and rules of conduct, among other things. And he sort of also helped to organize them as an army. So amazingly, surprisingly, the Jews managed to preserve their borders and even expand them somewhat from what the United Nations partition plan had intended. And there were armistice lines. There was no formal treaties at the time. They just agreed to stop fighting to what was the pre-1967 borders of Israel. The West Bank was in the hands of the Jordanians. There was no Palestinian state ever created because the Arabs had rejected the idea of having a separate state, and the Jordanian army had come in from the east, Transjordan. And so it was the Jordanian army that captured the West Bank and held the West Bank and even attempted to annex the West Bank, although nobody else recognized their annexation. So it was not, nobody except Jordan considered it part of Jordan. By the way, among the territories was, oh, hold on one second. I have to pause for a second here. I'm getting a phone. Sorry about that. Okay, so can you hear me, by the way? Everybody can hear me? Yeah, okay. So so what happened was there had always been, in the old city of Jerusalem, there had for at least since Ottoman times, been four quarters of the old city. There was what was called the Christian quarter, mostly Christian Arabs. There had been the the Muslim quarter. There had been an Armenian quarter and a Jewish quarter. So it was really like divided up into quarters, the old city. And the Jewish people had been living in the old city there for centuries. But when the Jordanians came in the 1948 war, they captured the old city and they forced all the Jews who had been living there for centuries to either leave the city or be slaughtered. So naturally, most of them just left. And that's when the old city was in Jordanian hands. The city of Jerusalem ended up being divided. So there was now a large part of the city that was outside of the old city walls. And it was divided. Part of it was in Israeli hands, part of it was in Jordanian hands. And actually a wall and a wire fence was built to separate the city in two parts. And the old city was in Jordanian hands and no Jews were allowed there at all. And of course, that was the most sacred place in Jewish history, a place where we had been allowed to go for centuries, even under Ottoman rule. The Temple Mount is in the old city. It would be sort of like telling Muslims you're not allowed to go to Mecca, or Catholics you're not allowed to go to Vatican City. But that's the way it was from 1948 until 1967. So there was an armistice line. Then there was a later war, and then the Six-Day War, which most people know about in 1967. The Suez Canal, which was just in the news because of the major ship that got stuck there. The Suez Canal was a major, even then, a major transport area, and the Egyptians cut it off to use for trade with Israel. It was a blockade. And every day they and the Syrians and the Jordanians were threatening the annihilation of the Jewish state. And then the Israeli army one day decided, the tanks were lined up on the borders, and everybody literally assumed it was going to be another slaughter, and the Jewish state would be destroyed. And then the Israelis decided to do a preemptive strike with their Air Force, and they basically wiped out the entire Egyptian tank forces the first day. and from then it started to look like the Israelis would actually win, and they did. They ended up pushing the Egyptians out of the Sinai Peninsula, out of the Sinai Desert. They pushed the Syrians, who had been shelling Israel from the Golan Heights. They're called the Golan Heights because they're up on high, and they had cannons up there, and they were shooting down at the kibbutzim below, the villages below. They'd been shelling them. So the Israeli army went up to the heights and they captured the heights. That was the Golan Heights. And they captured the entire West Bank from Jordan, including the old city. And it all happened in 6 days. And in the Jewish world, that was considered an amazing miracle. The Temple Mount was again in Jewish hands. Famously, the Israeli officer, Moshe Dayan, upon capturing the Temple Mount, gave the keys to the Temple Mount back to the Muslim Waqf, the Muslim authority that was in control of the Temple Mount and had been in control of the Temple Mount for centuries, even under Ottoman rule. And he said something to the effect of, "We came to liberate the city, not to conquer it." I doubt that any other army in a situation like that would have done the same thing, but that's what Moshe Dayan did. And that enabled the Muslims to maintain control of the Temple Mount, even though it was under Israeli governmental control. There were offers to return the West Bank or most of the West Bank for peace. And that led to the 3 no's from the Arab world: no negotiations, no normalization, no peace. And that, of course, eventually led to the tragic situation that we have today, where we still don't have peace. Eventually, in 1979, after yet another war, again, the Yom Kippur War against Israel, began on Yom Kippur. The Arabs thought that if they attacked the Jewish state on the holiest day in the Jewish calendar, they could catch the Jews by surprise and again destroy the Jewish state. And at the beginning of the Yom Kippur War, things looked really bad. Yes, Michael. Yes, that's true. Michael Oren wrote 6 Days of War about. Yeah, you can get the audio version. There's been a lot written about these wars. Anyway, and the Yom Kippur War looked really bad for the first few days, but again, the Israeli army managed to turn things around and recapture the Sinai Peninsula, recapture the Golan Heights, and recapture the West Bank. And after that, Anwar Sadat, who was the president of Egypt, realized that if the Arabs were not going to be able to defeat the Israeli army under those circumstances, then it was really pointless to continue to fight. And he offered peace to Israel, which stunned the Jews of Israel. And he came, actually, I believe, to the Knesset to present his proposal. And then, under the auspices of then President Jimmy Carter, they negotiated a peace treaty with Egypt, which has held to this day. So since 1979, it's been what we call a cold peace. It hasn't been, a lovey-dovey peace, but it's been peace. There has not been any conflict between Egypt and Israel, and in fact, a lot of security cooperation between the two countries. In exchange, Israel gave back the entire Sinai Peninsula to Egypt. And then in 1993, through some back-channel negotiations, the Palestinians seemed to be ready to make peace with Israel, and that's what led to the Oslo Accords. And in the early couple of years of the Oslo Accords, since it looked like peace was going to be made with the Palestinians, the King of Jordan decided to make peace with Israel independently, and he did in 1995, I believe. And so we have a peace treaty with Jordan, and that peace treaty has also held until this day. And there is, again, it's kind of a cold peace, but a somewhat warmer peace. The continued security cooperation. The Oslo process fell apart in 2000, and you can read about that. One of our negotiators, the United States, I say one of the Americans working on the negotiations was Dennis Ross, who's working with Bill Clinton. Dennis Ross wrote a book called The Missing Piece, P-E-A-C-E, The Missing Piece, that he wrote about his perspective of what went wrong in the negotiations. Some people say people had unrealistic expectations for what both sides were willing to agree to. But in any case, the thing blew up with the second, what was called the Second Intifada, which was a bloody, horrible terrorist war for a few years, and eventually led to Israel building what's called the wall, or the security barrier, along the West Bank, protecting Israeli areas. Surprisingly, Israel held the Gaza Strip. They didn't give that back to Egypt because that wasn't part of Egypt. It wasn't part of the Sinai Desert. It's a little strip along the Mediterranean coast, on the east side, the west side of the Negev. And that was not originally supposed to be part of the Jewish state. They didn't capture it in 1948, so it was held in Egyptian hands, but wasn't really part of Egypt. So when they negotiated the deal with Egypt, Egypt said, well, we don't want the Gaza Strip. That belongs to the Palestinians. So Israel held on to the Gaza Strip. And then Ariel Sharon, who was considered a military hawk in Israel, for various reasons, which we won't go into now, decided unilaterally just to withdraw from Gaza. They pulled up the Jewish settlements there, and he really angered the right wing of which was his wing of the political party in Israel, but he angered a lot of his own constituents, saying this is just a waste of our time and money and resources trying to defend these places. And he just evacuated them all, forced them to, many of them didn't want to leave. He forced them to evacuate from the Gaza Strip. And unfortunately, then it fell into a more radical group of Palestinian hands, the Hamas, who still have in their charter that they want to destroy the Jewish state. Anyway, we don't have peace yet. And right now, things don't look very promising. The government in Israel has been pretty much since the Second Intifada. Well, Ehud Olmert briefly was another prime minister who tried to make peace with Abbas, who is the current prime minister of the Palestinians. He offered Abbas a better deal than was offered by Clinton and earlier Israeli government, and that was also rejected. And since then, the Israeli government has been pretty much a right-wing government that hasn't really attempted to make peace, saying, look, we don't have a partner. Why should we even offer anything? We've offered several times to make peace, and there doesn't seem to be a party on the other side to accept peace. So it's a mess. That's a complicated story. You can read the story in the American Jewish Committee's booklet, but hopefully one day, I think we have to build trust there again between the two sides. We have to find a way to inform people of what each side's needs and desires are. One thing I will say, when people talk about the conflict and they don't know much about it, is they will say that, Israel was created because of, this is something that the Palestinians say, that the only reason the Jews, the world wanted to give the Jews our land is because of what the Europeans did to the Jews in World War II. And why should we pay for the mistakes of Europe? And another thing you'll hear them say is that this is just more European colonialism. You know, it's just a bunch of colonialists trying to take over another country. But as you can see from the history of this, neither of those statements is true. The Jews were always trying to reformulate their state, and we're in the process of getting a state before the Holocaust. And it's not about colonialism. The Jews are not a colonial power. They were never part of the European power structure. And in fact, Jews fled Arab countries when the state of Israel was formed, because the Arab countries, for whatever reasons, decided they didn't want to tolerate having Jews in their countries anymore. So most Jews left Iraq and Morocco and other Arab countries to come to Israel. So it's not just Europeans, it's Middle Eastern Jews who are living in Israel. So it's much more complicated. It's a very complicated problem. And if it was easy to solve, it would have been solved by now. So that's that. So now the question is, when does anti-Zionism become anti-Semitism? And for this, I would turn to this idea of the 3 Ds. Natan Sharansky was a Soviet Jewish dissident. So the Soviet Union had a lot of Jews after World War II, and they wanted to leave and they wanted to go to Israel. Many of them wanted to go to Israel, but the Soviet Union wouldn't let them go. And there were demonstrations here in the 1970s in this country to try and get our State Department to twist the arm of the Russians, the Soviets, to let the Jews leave the Soviet Union and go to Israel. And eventually they did. Natan Sharansky was one of those Soviet dissidents who was trying to organize Jews to leave the Soviet Union and go to Israel. And as a result of that, he was put in the Gulag, in one of the Soviet detention camps, as a dissident. When the Jews were finally allowed to leave, he left with them and he moved to Israel. And he became involved in Israeli politics there. And he's the one who came up with this 3 Ds. Demonization, delegitimization, and double standard. So people criticize every country in the world. Americans, notoriously criticize our own country. And many criticisms are valid, right? No country is perfect. They're all human institutions, and human beings are fallible. We all make mistakes. Some countries are worse than others, and commit more atrocities than others, and deserve to be criticized, and so on. But if you demonize Israel, and some cartoons tend to do, painting Jews as Nazis and so on, that's demonization. That crosses the line, at least in the opinion of most of us, that crosses the line into anti-Semitism. Then you're not just complaining about a policy of the government, you are demonizing the Jewish people. If you delegitimize the government, right? China is doing horrible things right now to the Uyghurs. Lots of countries doing horrible. Russia is doing horrible things in Ukraine. Lots of countries are doing horrible things all over the world. What Israel is doing is not, in my opinion, anything like that with the Palestinians. It's not good, but it's not, if we're putting things on a scale. Nobody says that China should cease to exist. Nobody says that Russia should cease to exist. What most of the people who are arguing against Israel want to have happen is that the Jewish state should cease to exist. And who knows where should the 6 million Jews go? They don't really care. That's delegitimization. And the last thing is the double standard. If you're holding Israel to a standard that you don't hold other countries to, then what is that? And I have to say that as a Jewish person, when you see the kind of venom that's pointed at the only Jewish state in the world, you have to wonder if classic anti-Semitism hasn't morphed from an attack on individual Jews to attack on the only Jewish country in the world. So that's kind of my view on that. Nevertheless, many American Jews today are upset about some Israeli policies, wish that Israel would try to do more to generate the kind of trust that would be necessary to finally settle this conflict. So that, has created some tension among some American Jews and the Israeli government anyway. There are Israelis, of course, even though they're now a minority, they're not voting in a majority government there, but there are Israelis who would like the government to do more. They just don't have a majority in Israel right now. And politics in Israel is totally messed up, by the way, I can say that. Our politics here have been pretty messed up also recently, I think, but in Israel, they've had 4 elections in just the last couple of years. And the country has been dominated by one prime minister for decades now, Benjamin Netanyahu. And he's not really well liked in Israel either, but he still manages to cobble together a majority government. So it's a very complicated political system there. It's a complicated political system, but they do have a form of democracy, and they are the only Jewish state in the country, in the world. So let me spend a little bit of time talking about the importance of that. I have a whole outline here. I'll just mention what this is, because that's kind of run out of time now. So this follows up on Ahad Ha'am's idea that having a Jewish country creates a flowering of Jewish culture. And so what I did was I took the definition of culture from the dictionary, and then I just expanded it to show how in all the areas of culture, Israel is just this massive tidal wave. I used to say a fountain, but now it's more like a tidal wave of culture that's just erupting out of this Jewish country. Very complicated, very nuanced. If you watched Israeli movies, Israeli television shows, they deal very critically with the Palestinian conflict, the conflict with the Palestinians. Many thought-provoking movies and TV shows are produced about it by, the artists in Israel. There is free speech, a freedom of thought in Israel, and criticism within Israel is expected. In fact, it's kind of a sport there to get into political fights and arguments. But in any case, it's a flowering of art, television, radio, motion pictures, all the modern forms of media, music and songs. There's just tons and tons of music. Dance, there's Israeli dance, folk dance, which I don't know if it's still active, but was active even just a couple decades ago. Hebrew language, we had Eliezer ben Yehuda reinvent the Hebrew language. You can Google him and see what he did in the 1800s, making a modern language. Poetry, journalism, humorous prose, theater. We have our own calendar, life cycle events. One of the things when I first went to Israel and I just went shopping in the store, it was just an amazing thing to see all the food packages were, of course, labeled in Hebrew. They're also labeled, by the way, in Arabic and in English, because all three are legal languages in Israel. But the major language that they're labeled in is Hebrew. Everything is in Hebrew. Road signs are in Hebrew, also in Arabic and in English. But road signs, maps, everything is in Hebrew. Hebrew language is native to the people who grew up there, of course. And of course, when they study the Bible, they're studying it in their native language. And the roots of Jewish literature are reinvented in modern Israeli culture and society in all kinds of ways. Every university has a Judaic studies department, a major Judaic studies department, a world-renowned Judaic studies department. And there are many universities in Israel. scholarly pursuits, scientific pursuits, technology. I mean, it is just a huge, amazing place, museums, and so on. So to sum it up, Israel is the cradle of our past, the cradle of Jewish culture in its past, and it is the cradle of the rebirth of Jewish culture today, which is why Jews in America continue to send our kids there to spend at least a year to to inhale that culture that is just a natural part of living in Israel. All right, I took too much time. Is there any, I will take a few minutes from Diana, just if there's any questions, because I touched on a number of controversial topics there. Any questions? There's much more to say about all of that, but you can Google it if you're interested, and you can read the articles and the books that are for the class, and otherwise get other books, like Michael Oren's book that's in the chat box.
Rabbi, I have a question for me.
Yeah.
Does Beth Yeshurun organize trips to Israel?
Yes, so we have in the past, the pandemic kind of put a crimp in that project, but I imagine that Rabbi Strauss will be organizing one maybe for next summer. I was going to organize one for people who are in my classes in various years, and I just haven't gotten it together to do that, but maybe I'll be able to do that. But yeah, trips to Israel, we will definitely probably have one coming next summer. Any other questions by anybody? I mean, you have to see the country to believe it. It's really unbelievable. My first year there was 1979, and it was really still almost a third world country. I mean, Xerox paper was like crepe paper. And I don't even want to describe what toilet paper was like. And that was if you had any in the public bathrooms. Now, you go there and it looks, the shopping mall is just like in America. It's really very much a first world westernized country. Okay. Have a good rest of the day, and look forward to seeing you again next week.
Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you so much.
Sure.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Bye-bye.
Shalom.
Shalom.
I wish I could have been in that session with you because I would have really enjoyed it. Did Steve tell you that we met in Israel? That's how we met.
No.
We were both studying in Israel. I was in Hebrew Union College learning to become a cantor. And Steve hadn't decided to become a rabbi yet, but he took a year off from being a lawyer to study in Israel. And there was a group of the sort of English-speaking liberal yeshivas. So that was Hebrew Union College, which was reform in the United States and progressive in Europe. And there was the Jewish Theological Seminary, which is a conservative movement. And then in England, there was the Leo Beck Seminary, which was for reform and conservative Jews in not just in England or Great Britain, but also in Europe. And so those students who were studying in their yeshivas, those seminaries, their yeshivas in Israel. Oh, and the Reconstructionists had a yeshiva in Israel. We would all get together once a month for a potluck Shabbat dinner that was organized by the Brits, by the Leo Beck Seminary. And I had never been to one of these potlucks, but about halfway through my year in Israel, I decided to attend. And Steve, for the first and only time, also decided to attend this potluck. And we just happened to sit next to each other and had so much in common. And you know, spent the next 6 months dating and then came back to the States, and he went to LA for his job and I went to New York to finish school. And we had a bi-coastal relationship for a year and then we got married. So Anyway, I really discovered Israel with Steve. He was like the best tour guide in the world. So anyway, so every time I go to Israel, it's like, you know, very sentimental for me. Okay. Let's go to page 76 in our book. All right. So 76 is chapter 21. We are getting there. We are almost through this book. And only a few of you have made it to the end. So it's like surviving some kind of, you know, survival. It's like a survival reality show. And you're like you're the finalists. Okay. So Chag Sameach, happy holiday. Right, and so Steve was talking about Yom Ha'atzmaut today, which is Israelis' Independence Day. Ha'atzmaut means independence. And so on a holiday, any holiday, including Yom Ha'atzmaut, we can say Chag Sameach. Can you say that? Chag Sameach.
Sameach.
Right, and Chag is holiday. And Sameach is happy. And you might have heard other versions of the word Sameach, like maybe you've heard the word Simcha, or in Ashkenazic we say Simcha. Simcha means happy, but it also can be used as a noun to mean a happy occasion. So if you're wishing somebody well for a party that they're planning, maybe a bar or bat mitzvah, or even a wedding, happy Jewish occasion, you could wish them a wonderful simcha. I hope you have a wonderful simcha, a wonderful happy occasion, right? So let's take a look now. So we're only learning one new letter, it looks like, and that is Gimel. Gimel. Hebrew, we have only one G sound, right? In English, we have two G sounds. We have giraffe, giant, right? But in Hebrew, they only have the G, like Google. We have that Gimel, Google, great, gorgeous, right? That's the G sound we have. It's the one that's made in the back of the throat, G, right? As opposed to giant, which is in the front of the mouth. Okay, can everybody say Gimel?
Gmail.
Good, okay. All right, so let's read our list of letters. Maybe we can try just reading them together. Bet, Tav, Tav, Shin, Mem, Lamed,
Lamed.
Kaf, Hey, Ish, Kaf, Vet, Dalid, Aleph, Vav, Kuf, Sadi, Ayin, Nun, Sofit, Chet, Yod,
Yod.
Mem, Sofit, Pet, Hey, Samech, Fei, Sadi, Sin. And I couldn't tell you why they do it in that order. Maybe if we went back the beginning of the book, we would see that that's the order they taught them to us in the book. I'm not sure. But let's suggest that maybe we go through each of the consonants for just a minute and try to find some lookalikes. So what letters look a bit like Bet? What other letters look a bit like Bet?
Kaf.
Kaf, right? Kaf looks a bit like Bet. What else?
Vet, but without the dot.
Right, vet, right? You could easily mix up bet and vet. You could mix up Bet, and Kaf. I would say there's one or two more.
The Nun,
Excuse me?
the Nun,
You know, you might be mixing it up with Nun because the Nun looks a little bit like a narrow vet, doesn't it?
a little,
A vet. You could also mix that up with Kaf.
yes.
So I would say Bet, Kaf, Kaf, Vet. I think Nun is a possibility, and maybe even Pei or Fei. Those are all letters that you could mix up with Bet. All right, now we're looking at Tav. Are there any letters that you think you could mix up with Tav?
Hey,
Hey,
Hey. Yes, I agree. Hey and Het are the two that you're most likely to mix up with Tav. What about Shin? Is there anything you would mix up with Shin?
Sin.
I'd say Shin and Sin. It's probably possible that some person at some time has mixed up Shin with Ayin or Tzadi because they have those little branches that go up. But it's hard to mix it up with that. But definitely Shin and Sin are easy to mix up. What about Mem? Is there anything that you could confuse with a Mem?
The Vav. Not Vav, Vet. I mean, sorry, Vet.
Yeah, no, Mem, somebody might say, oh, it's a side, looks like a sideways vet. You know, people have done that. It looks sort of kind of like sideways vets, or vet sort of like a sideways Mem. I mean, they obviously have differences, but people have mixed those up. And there's one other one that I've seen people mix it up with. I'm sorry?
Samic,
Well, the Mem Sofit you could definitely mix up with Samech, but maybe the regular Mem too, right? Because they both have that little feather up there, right? And then the other letter I was thinking of is sometimes people mix up Mem with Tet. Right, on the second row,
Oh, yeah.
3, 4, 5, 6 from the end. Second, and there's Tet. So sometimes people mix those up. Okay. I'm just going to tell you, sometimes people mix up Lamed with Vav and Nun and Yud, which we haven't talked about Yud so much, but Lamed looks kind of like a giant Yud. Can you see that? So sometimes if people aren't aware of the size of the different letters, they will confuse Yud and Lamed. And sometimes people mix up Lamed and Vav. And now, speaking of Vav, can you think of some letters that people might confuse with Vav?
Sophie,
Nun Sofit for sure, all the time. There's a couple of
and Dalit.
sometimes Dalet, right? Like Dalet is like a very extended Vav. And what else?
We don't have half Sophie, right?
There is Chaf Sofit. I guess we haven't had it yet. But that could happen too. But also Resh. People could mix up a Vav and a Resh. They do. And people mix up Vav and Yud. Because Yud looks a little bit like a fragment of a Vav, right? Like it broke off from the Vav. Okay, good. So let's practice Gimel on 76, line 1. I'll just read the lines and pause a tiny bit between so you can echo me, okay? Here we go, line 1. Ga,
Yeah.
go,
Go.
e,
Gi.
ga,
Ga.
ga,
Ga.
gay.
Okay.
Line 2, gag,
Gag.
Gag.
Galo,
Galo.
Galo.
Gabe,
Gabe.
Gane,
Gane.
Geese,
Geese.
Gear.
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 Good. Line 3. Golem,
Golem.
Magen,
Magan.
Gibor,
Gibor.
Oneg,
Oneg.
Geshem.
Geshem.
Line 4. Etrog,
Etrog.
Etrog.
Nagila,
Nagila.
Shigaon,
Shigaon.
Git Gadal.
Gadol.
Okay, so just out of curiosity, did anybody recognize any of the words that we just read?
Golem.
Golem, did you know golem?
It's
Does anybody know who the golem was?
No, I know of
No.
like is it a statue? Like I know like
There's a statue of the golem in Prague. The golem is kind of this mythical character who was kind of like a Frankenstein constructed by a rabbi in medieval times who supposedly saved a city, right, from a terrible adversary, a golem. But I don't know much more about it than that. So, but it's kind of there's kind of a myth about him. And if you go to Prague, there's a statue of the golem, and non-Jewish kids also learn the story of the golem in school. It's like one of the myths of the city. Okay, Magen. Does anybody know what Magen is? Like Magen David?
a shield.
A shield, right, or a protector. What about Gibor? A hero or someone who's mighty. A hero or someone who is mighty is Gibor. In one of our prayers, we sing to God, Ata Gibor le'olam Adonai. You know, you are eternally powerful, Adonai. Or what is an oneg? Has anybody ever heard of oneg Shabbat?
It's like food after.
This custom of having like a nice little dessert after services on Friday. At some synagogues have like tea and cookies and things like that, especially at synagogues that have a later service. Like some synagogues after dinner service where you have dinner and then services are at like 8 o'clock. And then after the service, they'll have like tea and cookies and things like that. We call it oneg Shabbat. But it comes from the idea of making Shabbat pleasant, to do something pleasant for Shabbat. And, you know, maybe having a relaxing little get together with desserts. Geshem, what's Geshem? Does anybody know? Rain. Does anybody know what an etrog is?
Citron.
Good for you. Good for you. Okay, we could continue, but it sounds like you know a lot of words. Okay, page 77.
There was one other word. I'm sorry. So it was like Nagila.
Oh, Nagila means let's celebrate. Or
I know that
let's,
have a Nagila, like right.
let's be joyful. Hava is like, come on, let's be joyful. Nagila, right?
Yeah.
Everyone has to YouTube Hava Nagila. All right. Every bar mitzvah band knows that song. You'd be amazed at who knows that song. Okay. Page 77. So if you have a chet at the end of a word with the ah under it, you pronounce the first. So on line 1 on the top of 77, it looks like it's going to be ko-ha. Ko-ha. That's what it looks like, but it's actually ko-ach. When the chet is at an end of a word, you pronounce the first. Ko-ach, mo-ach, re-ach, no-ach, si-ach, becho-ach. And this is much more common than you might think. And a lot of people forget this. So you learn this in religious school. They look at it one time and it's never reviewed and they forget. So this is a good one to remember because it's quite common. Okay, so we'll do the same thing as on page 76 where I can read it and you can echo me. Koach,
Koach,
moach,
Moach,
noach,
Noach,
siach,
Siach,
Yes.
bechoach,
Bechoach,
yareach,
Yeah. bakoach.
Bakoach,
It takes a little bit of extra energy to push the air through the at the end. Lenoach,
Lenoach,
kesiach, lishkoach, moach,
Moach,
nichoach,
Nichoach,
noach,
No.
Noach,
lehaniach,
Lechaniach,
mishtabeach,
Mishtabeach.
Now, this next exercise seems very difficult to me, but I'm just wondering, can any of you read any of these lines in the middle of 77? I don't think it's a realistic expectation for what we've done in the book. Does anybody recognize any of these lines of prayer?
I can try and read them.
Oh,
Or
really? Okay. All right. So Donna can go first.
Okay. Bore peri hagafen. Oh. Sorry.
Good. Okay, keep going.
Bore peri ha adama.
Good.
Bore mine ve shanim.
Good.
Bore peri ha 8.
Good.
Bore me ore ha ish. Is that right?
Correct. That's correct.
Hamotzi lechem min haaretz.
Fantastic. Fantastic. Okay. Now, I'm going to ask people to tell me which each of these is a blessing for. So what is Borei Peri Hagafen the blessing for?
The blessing of the wine.
Right. Creator of the fruit of the vine. That's the blessing for wine. What about Borei Peri Ha'adama? Maybe somebody remembers from Pesach. Borei Pariha Adama.
Plants of the earth or vegetables.
Right, good for you. Yes. And so, you know, when you're holding up your celery or your parsley at the Seder, this blessing, creator of the fruit of the earth. So that's most vegetables. Okay. What about Borei Mine Visamim? Does anybody know when we say that blessing?
Havdalah?
Good, it's Havdalah. And which thing are we blessing with? Mine Visamim, do you know?
I know that's the last thing that you say.
Spices.
It's not the last thing. The Borei Me Borei Ha'esh might be the last thing. It is the spices. It's the but good for you. Good for you. Mine Visami means kinds of spices or varieties of spices. Peri ha'etz. Borei peri ha'etz.
The tree.
Good. Good. So if you want to have an apple for a snack, you could say Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam borei peri ha'etz, and then you can bite into your apple. Okay. What else? Borei me'orei ha'esh.
The fire.
You're doing so well. That's right. And we specifically use this during the Havdalah, right? This is what we say over the flame when we're saying Havdalah. And 6, Hamotzi lech haaretz. Ooh. So what is that?
It's for the bread.
It's
So-
for the bread. Hamotzi lechem means brings out bread, min haaretz, from the earth. Brings out bread from the earth. Okay, page 78. Put a circle around the Hebrew word above for the book we read from at the Pesach Seder. Okay, so what is the name of the book that we read at the Pesach Seder in 78? What do we call that book?
Haggadah.
Right, the Haggadah, if you're Ashkenazic, or Haggadah, if you're using Israeli pronunciation. I grew up with Haggadah. Now I try to say Haggadah, although it doesn't always come out that way. Okay, so can everybody try to find the word Haggadah?
Well, I found it.
Yofi. Okay, don't tell us where it is yet. But if you are done with that, what is the name of the text that we read on Purim, the scroll that we read on Purim?
The Book of Esther?
Yes, it's the book. It is the Book of Esther in English. So you're correct. It's the Book of Esther in English. Do you know what we call it in Hebrew?
I don't recall.
You know, sometimes you'll even hear this on like cop shows on TV because it's used in a kind of vernacular form as a kind of a Yiddish idiom. So when somebody's going to tell a long story, they sometimes say, and he did the whole Megillah. He told the whole Megillah. In other words, really long convoluted story, and that's referred to sometimes by New Yorkers as the whole Megillah. But Megillah actually means scroll. Megillah means scroll, and we read from Megillat Esther on Purim, the scroll of Esther.
Oh.
But in American slang, at least American slang from maybe the 40s and 50s, a Megillah was like a long convoluted story. Obviously came from Yiddish. Okay, put a box around Chag Sameach. Can you find it? Okay, so first of all, where was our Haggadah? What line was the Haggadah?
Line
6.
Right, line 6, right before the end. There might have been other places, but it's definitely there. Oh yeah, I see it also on line 8. Okay, what about the Megillah? We find that. That's also in more than one place.
On 6, I found it also.
Yes, the Haggadah and Megillah are both on line 6. And where was the other place I saw it?
Line 5.
Yes, line 5 is Megillah. Okay, and where was Chag Sameach? Chag Sameach.
I also found it in 6.
Right. And what did we say Chag Sameach means? What does it mean?
Happy holiday.
Happy holidays. And which word means happy? Chag or Sameach?
Sameach.
Nachon, you're correct. Sameach means happy. Okay. Here on page 79, we're going to do a little bit of rhyming. Not rhyming, I'm sorry. That's the middle. I want to do the top. We're going to do some nouns that come with adjectives. So if we look at the top of the page, Tan is masculine for small, and kitana is feminine for small. Gedolah is feminine for big, and Godol is masculine for big. Now, I use those little symbols like the circle with the little cross T under it for female, and the little circle with the arrow for the man. But I would recommend when you're learning gender that you could write even just M and F or something to remember the gender of words, and it'll help you in the long run. So if a word ends with a, or if a word ends with et, or if a word ends with eat, so a, et, or eat, it's almost certainly feminine singular. Almost certainly feminine singular. If it doesn't have those endings, your odds are very good that it's masculine singular. Okay, I'm not going to talk about plurals right now. So anyway, here we go. So what is a shofar gadol?
Big shofar.
It's a big shofar. So draw a line from shofar gadol to the big shofar. Okay. What is a Torah kitana?
Small Torah.
A small Torah. So you can draw a line from Torah kitana to the small Torah. What is a Torah gedolah?
That's the big Torah.
That's the big Torah, although it's a very small big Torah. What is a shofar katan?
Small shofar, yeah.
It's a small shofar. So this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to say one of these objects in English, and you tell me what it is in Hebrew, okay? So what is a big Torah?
A big Torah, Gedolah.
Good, very good. And what is a big shofar?
Shofar Godol.
Good. And which of those is feminine? Is the Torah feminine or is the shofar feminine?
Torah.
Torah is feminine, right? How do we say small Torah?
Torah katana.
Right. Torah kitana. And how do we say small shofar?
The first one.
Shofar katan.
Tov, shofar katan. And which of those is masculine? Shofar, shofar katan or Torah kitana. Which of those is masculine? Shofar katan or Torah kitana?
Shofar Katan.
Nachon, shofar katan. Okay, let's see. How much time do we have? There's so many good exercises, but I really want to finish the book before the end of the year. Okay, let's do at least a little bit of chapter 22. I urge you to go back in chapter 21 and try doing all the exercises and practice the reading. But I'm going to continue to 22 so that we can introduce some vowel sounds. On page 80, our vocabulary word is kiddush. Does anybody know what kiddush means?
It's the cup that you drink the wine in from Shabbat.
Well, that is the action associated with that word. So on that level, you are correct. Kiddush means sanctification, right? Kiddush means sanctification. So Kiddush Delel Shabbat is the Kiddush for the evening of Shabbat, for example. Or we might call it Friday night Kiddush. And the Kiddush is not just the Borei Puri Hagafen. The wine is like a vehicle of saying Kiddush. It's like something that you have to say Kiddush in a ritual sense. But the sanctification is actually the long paragraph that comes after Borei Pri Hagafen. That is the real Kiddush. Asher Kiddushanu b'mitzvotav, who makes us holy with his commandments. Asher Kiddushanu b'mitzvotav v'ratzavanu. So it's that paragraph. And I would love to look at that if we had time. Maybe next week we can look at the Friday night Kiddush.
Yay.
That would be really nice to do. Anyway, the U can be written two different ways in the word Kiddush. It can be written like a vav with a dot in it to the left of a consonant, or it can be written under a consonant like a staircase going down. Do you see that? Those are two different ways of writing U. People sometimes ask me, why? I don't know. But these are two ways of writing U. Okay, let's jump down to the bottom of 80. Line number 1. Sue. Oh, I'll let you go after me. Sue,
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 two,
two,
new,
no,
moo,
moo,
Sue.
Sue,
Line 2. Boo, goo.
boo,
I'm sorry, I kept going. Boo,
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 goo,
boo,
shoo,
shoo,
roo,
roo,
coo,
coo,
two.
two,
And line 3. Who,
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 lanu,
lanu,
anu,
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 sood,
sood,
hulo.
who,
oh,
Line 4. Shum,
shum,
sukat,
sukat,
uv, hol,
ho,
lakum,
la, hum,
hu, lam.
Kula.
kula.
Good. Okay. Let's see, on page 81, some Hebrew words have more than one meaning. Shulchan is a desk or table. A luach can be a chalkboard, bulletin board, or even a calendar. So can you find the word shulchan and the word luach and circle those two words? I think in a day and age where a lot of us are like doing our job at the dining room table, I can really relate to shulchan as being a desk or a table. I'd really like to recommend that exercise that we have done a few times, where using the alphabet chart and the vowel chart, if you need it, that you can try to transliterate some of these lines in the reading practice section. And if you send them to me, I'll go over them and make sure that you do it correctly. Okay, did anybody find shulchan?
It's in line 3.
Right, that's the only place that I found it. Did anybody see it anywhere else?
no,
Okay, and then what about the word luach? I only found that one once as well.
Line 1,
Line 1, good, line 1. Okay. On line 7, Tell me what holidays you can find on line 7.
Purim,
Good. Purim,
Shavuot,
Shavuot. One more. Did anybody find it?
Yom Kippur.
Good. Yom Kippur. Yom Kippur. Good for you. Okay. We go to the middle of page 82. Okay. In 82 in the middle, there's a reading rule. So whenever you see reading rule, that's really important. This is how you pronounce the oo vowel when it has the yud after it, right? So some people pronounce the o vowel and the oo vowel with the yud the same way, like boy, like in boy or boy, but it's a little different. So it's, as it says here, it's ooey, like gooey, gooey. So it's not oi, it's ooey. Not oi, it's ooey. So it's sivui, kanui, asui, ratsui, galui, vidui, hanui, banui. That so far is definitely our weirdest vowel, right?
Yes.
Let's do that one more time, and then unfortunately I have to go. So let's do that one again. Sivui,
Sibui,
kanui,
Hanui,
asui,
Asui,
ratsui,
Ratsui,
galui,
Galui,
vidui,
Vidui,
hanui,
Hanui,
banui.
Banui.
Very good. Okay, I guess that's as far as we can get today. I'm so sorry.
It's good.
So if you review 21 and 22 and anything that you might want to transliterate, and you can email or text it to me, I'd be happy to go over it with you. Or if you want to read a section for me and record it, I'll go over that too. Okay. Kol hakavod. Good for you. Kol hakavod. And Chag Sameach, a little bit late for Yom HaTzmaut. And I'll see you next week.
Bye.
Thank
Thank you so
you.
much.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.